A number of years ago, I was called to a situation that was really difficult and intense for me. A guy that I'd known for many years had passed away, and his family called me right away. They wanted me to be a part of some of those immediate moments right after. I remember walking into the room and seeing his body there on the floor, and his family gathered all around him. And as soon as I saw him, my mind instantly went back to the first day that I met him. I remembered him as this youth kid who was full of life and excitement and passion, super mischievous. He had a really amazing, goofy grin. As I saw him, I just flashed through all the years that I'd known him, the decades that he had wrestled with addiction, the hardness of what he had put his family through, the intensity of the cycles of shame, and trying to work things through over and over again. And I very quickly realized I've got to pull myself together because I'm not here for me. I'm here for this family and the other people that are around, and I've got to kind of just keep moving on. As we spent a couple of hours together just praying and crying and talking and processing what next steps were supposed to look like and how do we continue to move forward as a family from this moment on, and funeral arrangements and all these different things. And after we'd spent a good time together, I got back to my car, I was headed home, and remember getting in my car and thinking, it feels strange. I feel kind of okay. This feels kind of weird. And as I got closer and closer to my house, and I thought about my kids who were super excited about a picnic that we'd been planning that evening, I just thought, I cannot look my kids in the face. I have no idea how to bring together this intense sense of loss and this really amazing sense of innocence and joy. I don't know how to bring the two parts of my life together in this. I remember pulling the car over about a block from my house and just sitting there and just letting it go. And just taking some time to just weep and cry out in the presence of God and just trying to hold open before Him all the pain of what I felt, all the intensity I felt for this family, the intensity of all of the loss, and all the pain and the shame and the cycles of all the intensity for this guy that I knew. Just crying out to God that we are in a world that is not as it is supposed to be. Again, parents aren't supposed to bury their children. Families aren't ever supposed to lose someone in this kind of particular situation. No one should have to walk through this particular kind of loss. And every single one of us in this room and anybody watching us online, we are all painfully aware that the world is not as it is supposed to be. We have all endured various ranges of hardship and difficulty. We have had beautiful, life-giving dreams that have shattered and come falling to the ground. We've experienced the intensity and the fear of difficult and painful diagnosis. We've experienced all kinds of pain and loss and uncertainty. Our souls have been so disturbed by the evils and the darkness of the world that is all around us. And in the midst of all of this, on some level, our souls cry out, this is not how life is supposed to be. This is not what we longed for. This is not what we planned. This is not what we intended. This is not what we hoped God would bring into our life and into our experience. And to make matters worse and even more challenging, our culture is really bad at processing grief and loss. Again, we live in a culture that moves so quickly, that moves so fast, and a culture that will tell us when we experience pain or loss or fear or disturbance in our souls, you just need to bury all of these feelings deep down. You need to cover them over with more entertainment or more busyness or more pleasure or more delight or more accomplishment or more achievement. You just need to try and pretend that everything is fine and move on. But every single one of us, no matter what we try and do, every human being on the planet still knows the truth. This is not how life is supposed to be. And on some level, all of our souls are crying out for something to be different, that something would change in a deep and a drastic way. Again, as Pastor Caleb said, there's this amazing section of Psalms, from Psalm 120 to Psalm 134, called the Psalms of Ascent. And these were the psalms that the people of Israel would sing or recite together as they moved from their homes up towards Jerusalem to celebrate all the different feasts throughout the course of the year. And the interesting thing about Jerusalem is it's up on a very high elevation, so no matter what direction you came from, you needed to go up to Jerusalem. And most people lived on a farm or in a town or a village or city outside of Jerusalem, and all these different times through the year, they would all come together coming up to Jerusalem. And whenever they would leave their home, they would begin to recite together as a family, a larger family, and then increasingly in communities as they moved towards the temple, they would recite these Psalms of Ascent together. And there's all kinds of different psalms within this section of about 14 psalms. There's a royal psalm, there's psalms of thanksgiving, there's psalms of praise and adoration. But the psalms of ascent begin where we so often begin, with this individual lament, with this cry of anguish out to God that life is not as it is supposed to be. The author of the psalm is crying out about all the violence and all the pain and all the sin and all the intensity of the world around them. They're crying out to God to make things different. And they present to us a very different perspective of how we can handle pain and loss and uncertainty and the fact that we live in the midst of a very sinful and broken world. And so the author of Psalm 120 wrote these words for us and for so many over the centuries to come together and to worship God through. I call on the Lord in my distress, and he answers me. Save me, Lord, from lying lips and from deceitful tongues. What will he do to you, and what more beside, you deceitful tongue? He will punish you with the warrior's sharp arrows, with burning coals of the broom bush. Woe to me that I dwell in Meshech, that I live among the tents of Kedar. Too long have I lived among those who hate peace. I am for peace, but when I speak, they are for war. Again, the Psalms of Ascent begin with this clear, this honest, this bold and powerful declaration. I call out to the Lord, and he answers me. And again, in the midst of our culture that would tell us when you are in pain, when your soul is disturbed, when you find that life is agonizing and painful, or you face horrors beyond your imagination, our culture will tell us, bury it. Distract yourself from it. But the psalmist does something completely different. The psalmist just says, I will sit in the presence of God, and I will hold out before him all of the anguish and all of the pain. I will cry out to him because I am disturbed, and I know that he will answer me. There's this beautiful sense of confidence in the wonder and the truth of who God is in his character. And so the author cries out to God, reminding us that the very best thing that we could ever do in the horrible, disorienting, painful moments of life is that we can go directly to the God of the universe and cry out to him. But I find it really interesting that this is so challenging for us to do. Again, when the world flips upside down, when you face horrors or wrongs or pain or sin or anguish or difficulty, what is our first response? Again, typically our first response is to say, I am going to fix it. I'm going to do whatever I have to do to force or cajole or manipulate people or change circumstances or work harder than I've ever worked before. I will fix it. I will control this situation and I will make it right. And eventually we might get to the point where we will tell people around us, this is the pain that I'm facing. This is the way that my soul is disturbed. This is the hardness of what I'm walking through. This is how deeply afraid I am. And I wonder why we find it so hard to go to God with this. Again, I think for some of us, we grew up in a situation or a church background that we have that told us that we should not go directly to God with this kind of emotion. We should never speak to God about our anger or our pain or the things that we're unhappy about in life. Again, maybe we were told that it's a lack of faith to express these things, or that it was somehow disrespectful. Or maybe even more likely, for many of us, we've just never, ever heard someone pray this kind of a prayer in our everyday life, and so we don't believe or recognize this is a deep and an authentic way to pray. And for some of us, we've also been told that we should never express these kind of emotions, maybe to anybody. Maybe we just bottle them up and bury them deep down all of the time. Again, so often as men, we have been socialized to say that we should never express our pain or our fear because it makes us look weak. And for some of you, you grew up in an environment where it was dangerous to express weakness of any kind because it would be exploited. And so you just find it hard to express these things even to God. For others of us, we find it really challenging to be honest with God about the hard moments of life because we are fighting desperately to keep our faith in God and the pain of life very, very separate. Because we're afraid that if these two things collided, we are afraid that our faith would not stand the weight of all of the horrors and the evils of the world around us, and so we hold them at a really strong level of arm's length. And in all of these things, it just reminds us that maybe, just maybe, we have forgotten who he is. We have lost sight of the Bible's perspective of the wonder and the glory and the truth of God. We've forgotten that he is the one who holds all of the universe together moment by moment, that everything has been created by him and for the wonder of his glory. And that he's not just infinitely powerful, but he is so very close and present. That through the person of his Holy Spirit, God himself lives right within us. That God is closer to you than your very next breath. And that in his love and his justice and his mercy and in his power, he has already done absolutely everything that is necessary to bring about salvation and the ultimate destruction of every form of evil. This is the intensity of his passion for you and for me and for us. And how often do we forget this? Again, when we read Psalms like this, we are reminded that the author of this psalm has absolutely no doubt about who God is. The author has no hesitation, no qualms about running directly to God and saying, this is the evil of my world. This is the hardship. This is the agony of what I'm experiencing. This is the way that my soul is disturbed. The author recognizes the might and the wonder and the power of God, but also the unique care that God has for the author. I love that the author isn't trying to play it cool. They're not trying to pretend that they're strong or that they're independent or that somehow they are able to handle all the hardness of life on their own. They're simply running to the presence of God and saying, I cannot deal with all of this on my own. It's just too big, it's too dark, it's too evil, it's too distressing. I'm too overcome with all that I'm enduring right now and the agony of the sinfulness of this world. And remember that these Psalms were so often written by the tough guys. They were written by the warriors, they were written by the kings, and they have no trouble expressing, I am not enough. And so I call on God because he is the one who will meet me in all of my distress. There's this powerful kind of confidence. And I want to remind us also that these are the inspired scriptures of God. These are divinely inspired ways to remind us this is how we should worship. God is directing us to know this is how we best communicate with him. And often when we think about worship, we think only about singing psalms of praise and adoration and the wonder and the glory of who God is. But these kinds of psalms remind us it is fully and utterly as much equally a part of worship for us to cry out to God in moments of agony and pain as it is to delight in the wonder and the power of his presence. This isn't a work that we do to begin to prepare our hearts for worship. This is an essential part of worship. What the author of this psalm is saying is, I trust you, God. Even in the midst of a world where people are coming at me with lies, when everyone around me is for war, in the midst of all of the horrors of what I am experiencing, I know that you are so much greater. And so I'm going to choose to cry out to you. I will call out to you. And when we do this, we are welcoming God into every single part of our lives, and not just the nice parts of our lives, but everything that we experience. This is a profound expression of trust. That even in the midst of a world where things are not going the way that the author hoped that they would go, the author is still saying, God, I believe in you. I trust in you. I know that you are glorious and powerful and compassionate and mighty, and that you will meet me in all of this. However you decide to work it out, I trust you that you are great and powerful, spectacular and so worthy. And so I'm going to bring it to you exactly as it is. In the midst of all of the uncertainty, all of the pain, all that I am unsure of, I will bring every piece of it to you. Then the author goes on to describe their distress, what the evil in the world looks like. They say, save me, Lord, from lying lips and from deceitful tongues. What will he do to you, and what more beside you, deceitful tongue? He will punish you with the warrior's sharp arrows, with burning coals of the broom bush. Again, this is just the author crying out to God, God, would you save me? I'm in the midst of a world that is so sinful, that is so destructive, and it's being aimed right at me. Would you rescue me in the midst of all of this? And in this situation, it's the lying lips of people around them that are saying all kinds of untrue things about this author. Again, this is how we feel when people lie about us. There's something so devastating about someone telling untruths about our experience and taking our character and twisting it and ripping it apart and distorting it. Taking the things that we are doing or not doing, telling all kinds of things that are just complete fabrications about us. We recognize that we can never convince someone of the truth of our situation, and we have no idea how far these lies will spread and no way of bringing the truth to all of those different circumstances. And so the author just says, God, would you deal with this? Would you fix it? Would you bring justice into this situation? They're crying out in anger and in frustration. They're saying, God, would you pierce through this lying tongue with a warrior's sharp arrow? Would you put an end to all of these lies that are spreading all around about who I am or what I'm doing? Would you just end all of these evil stories? Would you take coals from the broom bush tree, which was known for burning for a really long time as a strong kind of hardwood? Would you take these and would you just put an end? Would you bring about burning coals onto all of these evils, all of these lies? Would you bring justice? And again, you and I know exactly what this feels like. When we look at the evils in the world around us, this kind of pain rises to the surface. So I'm just going to keep my voice together here. Okay, this is the kind of pain that rises to the surface when we face the darkness and the evils of this world. When we see murder, when we see abuse, when we see rape, when we see genocide, when we see lies spread all around on social media or wherever, when we see people scamming the elderly out of their possessions, when we see all kinds of darkness and evil in the world, this same longing for justice rises in our souls. And somewhere inside we are crying out to God, God, would you just bring all of this to right? Would you put an end to all of these evils? Would you make everything come out the way that it is supposed to be? And a part of why we cry out to God like this is because we know one day He will bring everything perfectly to right. God is the only one who is justified to truly judge, because He's the only one who can truly see who is really responsible for what and to what extent. And we know that one day the fullness of the wrath of God against all evil will pour out, and He will bring about a holy and a perfect justice to everything. And so when we see the pain and the darkness and the sin and the anguish of the world around us, we simply cry out to God, God, would you deal with the intensity of all of this? And then the author moves on to describe what it is like to live in a place that is far from the presence of God. Woe to me that I live in Meshech, that I live among the tents of Kedar. The author is using these words to describe to their audience the disorientation of what it feels like to not be at home, to not be in the place where the presence of God is celebrated and worshiped and glorified. For the people reading this psalm in the early audiences, they would have understood what this meant, because the people of Meshech are described throughout the scriptures in lots of different ways. For example, in Ezekiel 32, those from Meshech are described as a really unholy people who are bringing terror to all of the inhabitants of the world. And those who dwell in the tents of Kedar are described in places like Genesis 25 as a nomadic people who journey through desert places with no real place of home. And so the author is saying, this is what my life feels like. I feel like I'm journeying through frightening places where people all around me are not in pursuit of God, they're in pursuit of frightening and terrifying things. They're bringing terror to the inhabitants of the earth, and there's so much evil all around me that I just feel afraid all of the time. And I feel like someone living among the tents of Kedar where I'm roaming endlessly, and there is no place for me to dwell in the long term. There's no place that can sustain my life. There is no way that I can rest in a place of home and feel fully satisfied. And have you ever felt like that? Can you identify with any of those feelings? Maybe now or in a season of your life, you lived in a place where you just felt constantly afraid. Because of the evils of the people around you, you were just constantly frightened of what on earth might happen to you or the people around you, because the world just feels so dark and the people around you feel so uncertain. Or maybe you've been through a season or are journeying through a season where it just doesn't quite feel like home, where things don't quite feel settled, where you feel that there's nothing that will actually satisfy the deep places of your soul or sustain you for the long term. Again, the people of God, we've often described ourselves as aliens and strangers in the world, those who are traveling or sojourning through the journey of life into our eternal home. And every single one of us would be able to express that we never feel fully complete. We never feel fully at home. We never feel completely satisfied. There's always so much that our souls are longing and craving for. Nothing feels like it just fits the way that it is supposed to. And so the author cries out to God, this is what life can be like. It can feel frightening. It can feel disorienting. It can feel like there's just something missing. It can feel like we're moving from place to place, longing for the presence of God that will satisfy the deepest parts of our soul. God, would you draw us home? And in the midst of all of these things, it is so satisfying to be able to go directly to the presence of God and say, God, I am just weary. I'm just weary of all of the sin. I'm weary of all of the darkness. I'm weary of all of the fear. I'm so tired of being afraid all of the time of all of the evil and dark things that might happen. God, I'm weary of running through life and never feeling like I can fully rest in your presence. I'm weary of feeling busy all the time. I'm tired of trying to fill and satisfy my soul with things that will never make me whole. And the author invites us to recognize that in all of these places, we can simply cry out to God and say, this is what my experience feels like. Jesus, would you meet me here? Lord, would you sustain me for every single part of this journey? Would you empower me to live it out rightly and well? And the sense of isolation for the author is also heightened by the difference between the author's desires and the desires of the culture all around them. The author says, too long have I lived among those who hate peace. I am for peace, but when I speak, they are for war. And the word that the author uses here for peace is shalom. It means a perfect sense of rightness and wholeness, everything exactly the way that it is supposed to be. Recognizing that this kind of life can only come from the presence of God and a life fully aligned with the presence of God. And the author is saying, I'm speaking into my culture, I'm speaking to my coworkers, I'm speaking to my neighbors, I'm speaking of a life that is real and full. I long for peace. But when I talk to people about this kind of life, they are for exactly the opposite. They just want war. They want to take what they can get by force or by violence or by dishonesty. They want to take everything they can for themselves. They are fractious. They are fighting. They are constantly moving in an unhealthy direction, and I am frightened by this. And again, maybe you know what that feels like. Maybe you know the isolation of moving in one direction when every single person around you seems to be moving in exactly the opposite direction. Maybe in your workplace you keep speaking for doing business in an honest way, but so many around you are totally fine and moving towards a dishonest gain. Maybe in the life of your home or somewhere else, you keep speaking for peace, for kindness towards one another, for a holy kind of gentleness. But people around you are for strife or for war or for conflict or taking what they want by force or bent on their selfish ambition. And it can feel so overwhelmingly isolating to feel like you are the only one in pursuit of what is good and right and pure and holy in the midst of a world that is racing in the opposite direction. And the author reminds us, in all of these things, we call out. They began this psalm by saying, I call out to the Lord in my distress because he answers me. The author has known God for a very long time. And through all kinds of other pain or hardship or disorientation or difficulties in life, they have cried out to God, and they've always known that God has heard them in any and in every situation. And so this situation is no different. Even though they feel surrounded by all of the lies and by all the accusations and by all of the movement towards war, they know I will go directly to the God of the universe. I'm going to call on him because he will hear me. And for centuries, the people of God used this as they moved towards the temple to celebrate in Jerusalem. As they gathered their family together and began to leave home, they would start by reciting these words together. I call on the Lord in my distress, and he answers me. On maybe a more humorous end, I imagine, it's good to know there's also probably family conflict with others going on long road trips together, even back in, the early centuries. It's not just my family that sometimes feels a little stressed getting out of the house. But again, they would gather together, they would head off towards Jerusalem to celebrate and to honor God, to worship Him, and they would start off with these words. They would lament openly to God the brokenness of the world around them, the pain and the anguish that they felt, the uncertainty, the isolation that they felt of being in a place that so often feels far from the presence of God. And as they moved towards Jerusalem, they would begin to recite the other Psalms as well. And I think back to those years ago when I came face to face with that particular experience of death and loss. I knew I needed something. I had no idea what. And all that I knew to do was to simply sit in the presence of God and cry out and lament the brokenness of the world that I live in and that I experience. And I wonder, for how many of us do we just need the same thing? For how many of us have we been stuffing down and shoving down pain and distrust and uncertainty and anguish for a very long time? And where do we just need the freedom of the release of bringing these hard and painful things into the wonder and the presence of God? I wonder what would happen to us if we followed the model and example of the people of God over the course of the next weeks, if we became increasingly comfortable with, on our own, crying out and expressing to God our loss and our pain. How much more joyful would our celebrations together be? How much more fully could we delight in and enjoy the wonder and the goodness of Easter in about 6 weeks and the fullness of all that Jesus has done for us? If we could be open and honest and boldly declaring to God, this is also where my life is painful and difficult. Again, we could do this in lots of ways. Again, you could do this simply by sitting in the presence of God and just internally crying out, lamenting to Him the hardness and the pain of all that is. Maybe you need to go to an isolated place somewhere and just scream and yell at the top of your lungs for as long as you need to just get it out. Maybe if you're an artistic personality, you need to paint it, or you need to sculpt it, or you need to dance it, or you need to write it into a song. Maybe if you're a more physical person, you need to chop wood with all of the aggression that you need to express the loss and the pain and the hardship of your soul. Maybe you need to go for a good long run and just push it out. Again, I wonder today, what are the things that are buried within us? What are those parts of our life that just feel distressing to your soul? Is it that feeling that you are moving in exactly the opposite direction of the culture around you and it just feels so isolating? Is it the anguish of all of the ways that you have been sinned against? Is it the intensity of living in a world that is mired in sin and destructive habits and moving in a very dark and difficult direction? Is it dreams that have died? Is it the fear of a diagnosis? Is it the anxiety of having to face reality every single day? Who knows what it might be? But the psalm invites us to recognize that we need real and authentic space to simply cry out to God in the midst of all of our distress, because He will hear us. And that this is important. This is as much a part of our worship as singing and delighting and praising Him is. This is not a preparation to worship Him better later on. This is a vital part of how we live life in relationship with God in the midst of a broken world. And so today we just want to create some space, and because we're all here in the room together, I'm going to encourage you just to do it silently inside so you're not distracting anybody else. But we just want to take a few minutes to just cry out to God in the midst of our distress. Because the wonderful news is that He hears every single one of us and that He will answer. And so we choose to cry out to Him, trusting Him for the right way and the right time to bring it all together, because we know the wonder of His character and all of the thousands and millions of ways that He has proved Himself faithful in the past. And so we simply choose to cry out to the Lord in our distress because we know that He hears us. And so again, as you feel ready, just cry out to God your own distress. Just take a few moments with Him.